Hello, I'm John Powell. On our oral history project today, we're talking with Tom Loftus, who, among other things, was the only four-time Speaker of the State Assembly. No one else in the history of Wisconsin ever lasted more than 3 terms in that office. In addition to being in the State Assembly, he was ambassador to Norway, worked with the World Health Organization against diseases, has been a member of the Board of Regents since 2005. So we have a lot to cover here. And, oh, by the way, in case people think we're jumping the gun, we're not insinuating here that your career is over, but I did notice in the Blue Book you're 4 days past your 65th birthday.
That's right.
So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
But let's start at the beginning. How and why did you get involved in politics?
Well, there is some family history that are early on in the fact that my mother and father, through my father's business, knew Patrick Lucy and knew Gaylord Nelson and
What business was that?
it was in the farm machinery business in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, called Brooks. And in fact, Bill Proxmire worked for my father for a short period of time. This was when Bill was trying to build his resume as a common man. I don't think he sold a ounce of farm machinery, but I do remember being with him during that period. But I think that my involvement came from the times that I lived in and the fact that I was drafted into the Army during the Vietnam War. I did not go to Vietnam, but drafted. But this was the height of the civil rights movement. So I was in college in 1964, 1963. Kennedy had been assassinated, Martin Luther King, all of these tragic events. So really it was the war and the civil rights movement that I think affected my generation the most at that time. And political involvement, I think, became quite a possibility in my mind.
How did the Army affect you?
Well, looking back, one, I did not go to Vietnam. I got sick at an appropriate time and missed my unit going to Vietnam. I ended up as a military policeman in El Paso, Texas, and John, not one Viet Cong, came over the Rio Grande that whole time. I was thrust into a position of great responsibility at an early age, becoming a military policeman. They went down the row and picked the tallest people and said, "You're going to be an MP." The second thing is that in my company of over 500 people, it was only myself and one other that had ever gone to college, and neither one of us had graduated. So the people I were with were really from throughout the country, and those at the time who were able to get caught in the draft and had no way out. So it was a great broadening experience for me. It was also a time of serving with a lot of blacks from the South. This is an experience I don't think anyone else my age would have received had they not been in the Army.
Now, the draft ended in, what, 74, which means that today very few legislators, members of Congress, and so forth have any military experience. Is that a bad thing?
Oh, I think it is. I think it is. When I was first elected, veterans issues, in the war itself, in fact, was still a big concern with legislative proposals. I was in that period when many of the legislature, many of the members of the legislature had World War II as their experience, a few with the Korean War. And there was then a new generation of who had the Vietnam War as their experience, veterans, different needs, different outlook. Steve Leopold served with me in the Assembly. He had been a prisoner of war for, I think, 5 years. When I was first elected in 1976 and then on, there was a period of veterans issues that were dominated some discussions and were very controversial.
When it comes to war and peace, Congress voting on a war or supporting the Iraq War, for example, would it be better if there were more military veterans in there?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's probably lost now. I know that there are some members of the Wisconsin legislature now who have served in Iraq, and they have their experiences, and that's very helpful. At the university, we have, once again, a large group of veterans who help the student body, who really make the place more of an experience for the other students than it would have been. So we're in one of those periods now, like the post-World War II, not only post, but during Vietnam. Vietnam went on until 1974 and had started in 1963. So yes, it would be good.
So then after the Army, you went back to school, Whitewater, and then Madison?
Whitewater. I went to Whitewater. I had, I think, as I tell people, they love to hear this, that I flunked out of college and then was drafted. Those things weren't very far apart in those days. But I did go back to school. Veterans were treated quite good. I was then in a hurry. And I finished undergraduate. I went to Whitewater and Madison. And I went then to Madison for graduate school for 2 years, to what is now the La Follette School of Public Policy, and was in school for 4 years under the GI Bill.
Were you consciously preparing for a career in politics then?
Yes, I was. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it. My course of study, I had started to volunteer in campaigns ever so slightly. You know, I can remember having a Paul Soglin bumper sticker.
Mayor of Madison,
Mayor
first time he ran, long ago.
Long ago. But I became very interested in state politics rather than federal. And I can't tell you how this came about, but I had started to set my sights on working in the legislature, which I did.
Yeah, so first you went to work for the legislature as an employee.
Mm-hmm. I was hired by the caucus staff director, Dick Randall. There is no longer a caucus staff, and at that time that was just the beginning of it. He was a former TV reporter from Green Bay who had been brought down to run this caucus staff, 5 people. And he saw on my resume that I had been a military policeman, so he thought, well, this is a conservative Democrat, so I'm going to hire him. And I was hired as the speechwriter. I'd never written a speech in my life.
For all the Democrats?
I wrote speeches for all 66 Democrats all day long, day after day after day.
Wow, that sounds like a heck of a job. You tried to tailor it to their personality?
Oh, absolutely. But as you remember, there is what was called a squawk box, that you could listen to the debate. So I listened to each of these members speak, and I got to the point where I could literally write in their cadence and their use of words. This helped me greatly later when I wrote a book and could really put down on paper the way the legislators spoke at the time.
Now, you worked for the Speaker. Was that Norm Anderson?
It was Norm Anderson. I was hired by Norm to be his assistant, and there was only one. And so I literally...
He had a staff of one.
Well, he had a staff of one. That was me. So I literally did everything, including from assigning parking places, my greatest power that I had ever had, to doing a first draft of committee assignments and bill referrals, and I just literally did everything.
Did you realize that you were in training to be Speaker yourself? Or did
No,
you hope?
but you became very familiar with what the job entailed, and essentially it was human relations and a great confidence in yourself, I think, and the ability to explain the obvious and knowing that it's not that obvious to other people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's definitely in training to become the Speaker.
And then you decided to run yourself from Sun Prairie. your
From Sun
hometown.
Prairie. David O'Malley, who was in the assembly and had that seat from Sun Prairie, had just survived a close election the cycle before.
Is he a Democrat?
He was a Democrat. He was a farmer from Wanakee. And he told me 2 years in advance that he wasn't going to run. So he literally tipped me off that there would be no incumbent and encouraged me to run. He did not want his seat to be lost to the Republicans, and he felt in this way this was his best chance. So I ran in that primary in 1976 against Tom Hebel, was one of the other candidates who later became a member of the Assembly, and ran in the general election against Shirley Thompson. No relationship to Tommy Thompson. The big issues were agricultural issues, where the new road would be between Madison and Platteville.
151, you know.
151.
Going north to northwest, or northeast.
And this was also the post-Watergate period. The first. This is the first election after Watergate.
Lots of Democrats won.
Lots of Democrats won. Jimmy Carter won. Money issues, ethical issues, change kind of ruled the 1976 election. But the other issues were what became later known as community property, but at the time was an inheritance issue where farm wives and small business owners didn't have the right to inherit the property that they had built up with their husband. That was also the start of the fight for teachers to have the right for collective bargaining, but not the right to strike. And this is how Wisconsin eventually ended up with what is called the binding arbitration law. And that was a dominant issue, a very divisive issue, as was the community property. So it was an exciting time to run. There were real issues, I mean, and not much ideological about it.
And what was your campaign like?
Well, I wrote a chapter in my book about this campaign, and it was essentially calling on my expertise of, just prior to that, I had been involved in the Udall for President campaign, a primary campaign in Wisconsin. You remember President Udall?
Yes. Capital Times announced him, I believe, that he won Wisconsin.
It was the Milwaukee Sentinel announced that he won Wisconsin, but then Carter turned out to have won in the middle of the night. Well, I had a group of people that I had been working with and leading on that campaign, and they simply transferred their allegiance to me, which was a great advantage. And then essentially it was going door to door.
Did you spend much money?
I think it was a record amount, and it was $11,000, maybe the total cycle. In other words, the primary and the general.
And that was high then for
that was high, but you could pay for television campaign ads, radio ads, mailing. You had to mail at the time. Mail was the big expense. And
did you do television advertising?
I did. I was on the Farm Hour with Jerry Dean at noon.
In the early morning? Oh, at noon.
At noon.
On Channel 3, very
On
popular
Channel
show
3.
in Wisconsin.
That's
and
right.
Madison.
And then I did a few other spots here and there, but that was the primary one. But developing lists of voters was my claim to fame. I had learned how to identify the voter, the likely voter, and then have another system to identify those who would vote for me and then who would likely vote for me, and then how do you get that group to the polls. And that was so far ahead of everyone else at the time. And there was no electronic way to do with this. These were all written or typed polling lists.
And they were based on what, contacts with the individuals on the list?
You typically got a list from the town clerk,
Voting list.
a voting list, which was a book where people had written their names, or the town, or the city or village, which had a more elaborate list. That list told you who was registered to vote and which elections they voted in, and you took that base information and then got your voters to the polls.
How did you know which ones were likely and leaning and?
Well, had a system of 1s, 2s, and 3s, and A's, B's, and C's.
But I mean, what indication did you have? You see Joe Smith as a registered voter. How do you place him in one of these categories?
You go and look to see if Joe Smith voted in partisan primaries.
Ah, okay. So you find the Democrats that way.
You find the Democrats that way.
So it'll say which primary you voted in.
Right. You wouldn't want the spring nonpartisan
Right.
primary or municipal elections. You targeted that election. Then you went to see if Mr. Smith voted in the general election. And then you went to see how many primaries and generals did Mr. Smith vote in over a period of time. And that's how Mr. Smith got to be a 1.
And then getting him to the polls was the next thing?
If he was a Democrat who voted that consistently in primaries and general elections, then he was a 1A. And 1As were the ones you literally dragged to the polls.
You called them up and gave them a ride and...
You went to their door several times. I mean, this was retail politics. No computers, all done with index cards.
What was the final tally? Did you win big?
I won the primary quite big, but the general election, I think it was around 56% of the vote. If you looked at that district going back and you looked at it going forward, that was about the typical turnout for a Democrat. So,
I was going to say that's not a bad,
no,
bad for a Wisconsin assembly.
And a non-incumbent, yeah.
So what was the legislature like then?
Well, this was the Republicans at their lowest point.
In numbers?
In numbers. There were 66 Democrats out of 99, with the Democrats holding seats that they hadn't won since 1932, when the Roosevelt landslide was. So you had a lot of people there with no political experience, faculty members, wives of faculty members, farmers, whoever got on the ballot had a good chance of winning. Very young. I would say that they were prompted to run for the same reason I was. Watergate, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, all had prompted these people.
You had a couple of 21-year-olds, David Clarenbach.
Kevin Soucy from Milwaukee was only 19 when he was elected, and Michael L. Condon was only 18 when he was elected.
Was that in '76 or?
They were elected the session before, but so they were 74, I think.
So that was immediately after the voting age amendment, almost instantly.
Right, when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18. It was a time of camaraderie, high expectations, the idea that anything could be done. Ethics and campaign finance reform became part of the agenda. But it also was the start of the environmental movement. Now, we were still doing very many civil rights type legislation, housing discrimination, redlining by insurance companies, landlords that wouldn't rent to blacks. There was still a lot of this legislation ongoing at this time. The environmental issues had just started, and a lot going on there. But this was also the start of the women's rights or equal rights era. And this, as I mentioned, manifested itself in two ways. One, no-fault divorce. This wasn't the idea that divorce could be an agreement between spouses. Up until that time, you had to go to court, and the one spouse had to testify that the other spouse was a bad person, and that met the test. So a no-fault divorce, and then the idea of community property. There were some other issues, for example, teacher salaries. Women were uniformly paid less than men. It was what they used to call a head of household. If you were a man, you got more because you were a head of household. So all of these things started to bubble up to the surface, and they were all controversial. I mean, this was change from the past, and quite radical change. But it was also of the times. This was going on in other states and in the country.
Was it ideological in the way that change has become today?
No, I would say not. Think of no-fault divorce. It really had to do with the actual experience and understanding of the members of the legislature themselves. And lawyers on both sides argued. Norm Anderson was a great advocate. He had been in court saying what a sham this system is. John Shabazz was against it, but he was against it because he said he had a conservative small c. He said divorce should be hard. It should be difficult. Is there an ideological view in both of those? Probably not much of one. Inheritance rights have been going on ever since Adam was a baby. So you have this continuum. And if women were equal, why didn't they have equal rights to inheritance? Now we see community property as part of the...
I was going to say, most of these, you got what you aimed for.
This was a period of great productivity in the Wisconsin legislature, great changes in state law that affected individual lives one after another. So the attention paid to the legislature was quite a bit of scrutiny and interest, because every one of these bills affected every person in the state. It wasn't a slice of the population, it was everyone. And this was also the time that was the start of the abortion issue, but I can't say that it was anything other than the start, because that Roe v. Wade hadn't happened much before 1976. But as you recall, this was also a period where the Arab oil embargo started.
The oil shock, 74.
And the inflation of the Carter years. And we had several sessions, including special sessions, on energy conservation, including passing a gas rationing bill. Should the need arise, a system where you would have ration books and
the state would do this?
The state would do this.
Oh, I don't recall that one.
This was and we had a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on our highways.
That we all recall.
And then there was solar and wind and insulation things. It's very similar to what is going on today.
So then, after the euphoric 70s, we go into the 80s. Now, you became a majority leader of the Assembly in 81. Mm-hmm. And then 4 terms as Speaker, 83 through the 89 sessions.
I was in a hurry. I had served 2 terms. I had never been even a committee chairman, and I was elected majority leader.
How did that happen?
Well, I think I have to go back to the Army, where I was just natural for me to be a leader. and under the Speaker's office, I knew how the place worked. I knew where the levers were, and I knew the people. So I led a group of freshmen. We were called the Tuesday Club, and we wanted reform faster. I think it's the best way to put it. I participated in debates on all of the big issues, and I carved out for myself, because of interest, a real expertise in welfare and health care issues. And these were also dominating the discussion.
And expertise, obviously, in keeping your members happy.
Well, and
we should point out that other speakers have burned out after 3 terms or less, basically used up all their capital, made enough people angry that they simply couldn't continue in the job. You managed 4 terms.
Well, and I think I was the only speaker in history ever to be elected unopposed, meaning there was 1 term the Republicans did not put up a candidate against me. I have to admit that I worked out a deal with Tommy Thompson for this to happen. He was the minority leader, but I had a strong belief that you couldn't be an effective speaker or a majority party unless you had an effective leader of the minority party. You had to make a deal with somebody. And my philosophy was the Republicans have to be involved. They're not going to win, but they're going to have to be involved, and we have to make a deal. My primary goal, duty, responsibility, was to pass a budget. And you can pass a budget that's a much better budget if you have minority party influence. So I think that's the basic reason for the 4 terms. I had no one mad at me in my own caucus, and was always on good terms with the minority leader and the minority members.
Did later Governor Thompson get much by dealing with you, or how did this dealing go about?
Oh, a lot of things. I think one tangible thing is I gave the Republicans another seat on the Joint Finance Committee.
They'd had only 1 from each house, is that?
They only 1, and I think they ended up with 3 during my period as Speaker. A Speaker can do things unilaterally or can empower the minority leader, and I did not do things unilaterally. These are little things, from control of staffing, control of parking places, who gets to say who goes on a trip, often called a junket.
Well, these are the things, the nuts and bolts of being a leader, apportioning the office space. Everybody wants prime offices, the parking spaces, as you say, all of these perks, and you're in charge of apportioning them.
Right, plus you didn't want any losers. In
Right.
other words, in the legislative session. I mean, you can lose a vote, but you need to have your opportunity to get your best shot out there. And the perennial losers had an important issue, and I always tried to give it its full airing and make people see their point of view. And I'll just use one example. What became known as school choice started out as a goal of the Milwaukee area legislators, the part of the city, to have a separate neighborhood black high school. And this, we're back when the Milwaukee public school system was not functioning as it should. It still isn't. But this debate, they said, you don't know what's going on in our neighborhoods. We want to say over our kids' schooling and where they go to school. Well, here was a time talking about the civil rights movement. Milwaukee was still under a court-ordered desegregation plan.
With heavy busing.
With heavy busing. This change they wanted was probably unconstitutional, but it was a symbol, more than a symbol of this isn't working.
I think, if I remember, their main complaint, so many black kids were being bused all the way from the inner city out to the suburbs, under the idea that simply sitting in a classroom with white kids would improve their education, I guess, was
Well,
the way they saw it.
that was sort of the belief, almost the academic belief. But you know, that had a monetary component. The school district were paid based on how many students from the city they would take. And you got to a point where state aid to schools was skewed in such a way that busing became part of how you got money. Yes, you're right. The buses would come into the central city, pick up kids and disperse them everywhere except in their neighborhoods.
Taking a huge chunk of time out of their day,
Yes,
too. So
yes.
you can see why the black parents were
Right.
not happy.
And this then evolved into what became choice and later voucher systems and currently charter schools. And busing finally was ended. But other cities, Boston, elsewhere, were under these similar court orders, and it was very, very. There were a few things that divided the Democratic caucus along ideological lines, liberal and conservative, but it's almost more geographic rather than ideological. This was one. We had several fights with labor unions, the Democrats did, during this period. This was at a time when Wisconsin had strong blue-collar labor unions. The teachers, the municipal employees hadn't really come on the scene yet. The AFL-CIO, the UAW, the brewery workers, these were all big unions that were in the Democratic camp. Many of the Milwaukee legislators wanted to end the freeway building in Milwaukee. It was destroying the city. They said, we have to stop building freeways through and around the city. It's destroying it. The unions, of course, said, this is jobs, you can't do that. We debated and passed a moratorium on nuclear power plant construction. This was also a fight with the unions. I personally invoked a fight with the unions by introducing what was called the bottle bill, that each disposable bottle had a deposit. We're still in a time when Wisconsin had a large brewery industry and a brewery workers union that had some. Now all of these things are gone, and I think one of the great laments and tragedies of Wisconsin political evolvement was the loss of these unions, but particularly the UAW, which was a broad Wisconsin and national union with workers almost in every district of the state ofWisconsin. You know,
it's not just Janesville or Kenosha. There were suppliers almost everywhere. Suppliers
everywhere and manufacturers everywhere, and the UAW had Kohler, for example, was a UAW plant. And there had been a long strike against Kohler in the 1950s. And we had a legendary UAW leader here, Ray Majerus, whose son became coach of the UWM basketball team, and then I think the Milwaukee Bucks at one time. So this I think kept the Democrats in line, but also you had to balance this jobs versus environment, jobs versus right things. And there isn't that much now. I think the teachers came along and supplanted the blue-collar unions. And this fight over teacher collective bargaining rights happened. It was successful. The law was successful. All of these things I'm talking about, these laws that were enacted, were successful. They changed society dramatically, and they worked. However, then the Democrats, I think, basically started to be not captive of the teachers union, but there was always one more agenda. And personally, I parted ways with the teachers union in a philosophical sense when we had at this time a movement to divest stock owned by the state pension plan of companies who had facilities in South Africa. And this was a way to fight apartheid. And I was a leader in this, but also our black members and the more liberal members said, we're holding stock, paying ourselves pensions, basically off the labor of people who are slaves. And the teachers and other public employee unions said, well, that may be a noble cause, but these are our pensions, you can't touch them, and the board should be able to invest in whatever they want. And we had quite a fight over this.
How did that come out?
We never passed a law, but of course there were federal sanctions that came along later that did the trick. However, we were able to, and you see it today, to have instilled into the law and into the processes that holding stock in companies that are engaged in unethical practices, they meet a higher standard. You can see an echo of this today with the University of Wisconsin ending their association with Nike. This was part
So even though that no law was passed by Wisconsin specifically, certainly the spirit has been largely...
Right. And I mean, you know, it seems like such a distant time, apartheid and community property and civil rights and environmental movement and women's rights. But this was all unfinished business from the 70s. The university at this time still hadn't really completely merged. As you know, we had two systems. They were merged in the 70s, and all through the 80s, almost the implementation of merger was going on. We had a severe recession in the Midwest in the early 80s, 81 to 85, which changed not only our economy, we lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, but it's put such a strain on state resources that we had to do something about spending at the university. And we had a couple of fortunate experiences. I formed a committee on the future of the University of Wisconsin system. Tommy Thompson was the co-chair. We're both alumnus. And what are we going to do? And the other thing that happened is Donna Shalala came to Madison. So you had a strong person to deal with. And we had a good president to deal with, Buzz. I'm blanking on his name, but he was the system president. And what we did was we had to cap the enrollment at certain campuses. Certain campuses were growing willy-nilly, other campuses were withering. It's like having a house and you only live in 3 rooms. So Whitewater, Oshkosh, Eau Claire, we put caps on them, literally to force students to go to other campuses. Second, we were able to, despite this recession, pass faculty catch-up pay. The university faculty had fallen so far behind peer institutions that we did this, but the fight, which was probably the last fight of merger, is that we said we're not comparing Platteville and Madison. We're comparing Platteville to its peers, schools like Platteville, other places in the country. Madison will be compared to its peers, Berkeley, Austin, Michigan. This was quite a fight, as you can imagine. No, we want to be compared with Madison. So I think this was the final merge of the merger years.
Before we go, we've got a lot to cover. Your race for governor and being an ambassador and so forth, but you mentioned your book. Can you give us a couple of what you learned from your years in the legislature?
Well, the book was published by Congressional Quarterly Press in 1994. It was used by colleges throughout the country. It's still used. My big mistake was not putting out a revised version.
Mention the name.
The Art of Legislative Politics, published by Congressional Quarterly Press. It was 7 case studies using the real example of the Wisconsin legislature with real legislation, but applicable to state legislatures throughout the country. And it was about campaigns, leadership, guns, the teachers' union, abortion, money in politics, and we had gone through all of these issues. So I used a real case study with real people, real bills, and it was a delight to write.
And I would recommend it too, by the way.
Thank you.
So you decided to run for governor in
1990. Mm-hmm.
You were, by this time, Tommy Thompson was governor and quite popular. So were you kind of the sacrificial lamb? Or?
He wasn't that popular. This was the end of his first term, and he had had a couple of tough budgets. There were some very one-time issues floating around. The lottery. What happened to the money? The lottery was sold on the idea that the money would be used for property tax relief. Indian fishing rights, sovereign rights of tribes in Wisconsin. An abortion issue that wasn't on the main subject, but it provided a tough one for him. And so he hadn't reached his popularity yet, and on my behalf, I wanted to get out of the legislature. This was a way. Second, I observed from other people that being an ex, running and losing wasn't the worst thing that could happen to your career. Pat Lucy was my great teacher on that score. But that campaign was fought on those issues I mentioned. Health insurance for children. But I got 43 or 44% of the vote, which was okay. It was the first election, I think, where a candidate for governor spent more than $1 million. No, I've talked to Tommy about this. Neither one of us understood there was that much money out there. There was public financing. There was PAC money, but that became less important than the number of individuals that would actually give money. So he spent, I think, $2.5 million, and I spent a little more than $1 million. But no race for governor before that had crossed the $1 million mark, I believe.
No candidate had.
No candidate had. So it was, you know, I regretted the loss for about 20 seconds and went on with life.
Sounds like a resounding defeat. I guess it really isn't. You look at the other side. I said 56 that you won by was normal.
Yeah.
But did you know leading up to it that you weren't going to win? Why did you lose?
I don't think Tommy had done anything particularly wrong. In other words, throw the incumbent out. An incumbent's a tough person to beat under any circumstances. Second, my agenda was my agenda. I think I was bored with the idea of talking about the issues that may have been wedge issues or others, like the lottery. I once called the lottery a tax on stupidity. That'll give you an idea why I'm not the governor. Property taxes were a big issue, and no plan You can't, I mean, it was impossible to gain votes on one property tax relief plan versus another one.
Well, let's go on to your ambassadorship.
Yeah.
Let's skip ahead. President Clinton appointed you ambassador to Norway. Obviously, you're of Norwegian heritage. Was that part of the reason?
A little bit. I had always been involved in presidential politics ever since the Udall race in 1976. So I had been the chair of the Mondale for President campaign in Wisconsin, the chair of the Dukakis campaign, and I really got to know Governor Clinton during this period. I had become a national leader on children's legislation in the area of child support and other issues like early kindergarten and whatnot. Healthcare. These were all things that were important in Arkansas at the time, whereas we talked about lowering the rate of premature death for babies. They were busy hiring midwives in Arkansas. It was a different value. But I got to know him, persuaded him to come to Wisconsin in 1988 to speak to the convention and to support Dukakis. Became quite close friends, and when I ran for governor, he happened to be the chair of the Democratic Governor's Campaign Committee. And you know, it's a taboo for one governor to campaign against the sitting governor, but Clinton did manage to get me some money from them and did come to campaign for me. However, I thought he was the least likely of the people I had supported to become president. I'm sure I wasn't alone. So he asked if I would support him, and I said yes. When he won, I was pretty much spent. I couldn't imagine going to Washington and being thrown back into a political milieu of intense day-to-day debating over how many angels can fit on the head of a senator. So I said, I want to join your administration, but I want to be the ambassador to Norway. Talk about being an adept politician. I gave him no choice. I didn't say I wanted to be an ambassador. I want to be in your administration. I want to do something in foreign. I said, one choice.
Had you had a previous interest in Norway? Had you been there before?
Yes, I had been there many times, and I had become very well versed in the Norwegian American population in the U.S. and knew Norway quite well, in fact.
That was a good fit. And that's not always the case with an ambassador.
It was a very good fit. I almost didn't make it. When I went to see Clinton in the Oval Office in February of what would that be, 1993, he had only been sworn in a few weeks earlier. It was just the two of us and the staff people, including Jim Bailey, who worked in White House personnel, who was a person who ran against me in the 1976 primary. Oh. Be nice to people you meet on the way up, you'll see them again, particularly on the way down. But anyway, this was a deal. And I came in and asked for it, and we had a wonderful talk, and he gave me a tour of the Oval Office and opened the medicine cabinet and said, there's my allergy medicine, and we went over and there's a new rug, and I mean, it was just, someone later said, it sounds like you did everything but get on the floor and play with toy soldiers. Well, it was quite a meeting, and at the end, politicians have this way of talking. I want to be appointed president to Norway, or ambassador to Norway. I know you know that. He said, I think it's an excellent idea. That doesn't mean he's going to do it. But so when I left, as I learned later, he wrote on my file not a bad idea, and gave it to his staff. A staff person took it and read it to, he was left-handed with his squiggly, and read it to mean that no, a bad idea. So my file went on the bad stack, and for weeks went by, and I was asking Herb Cole and everybody, well, where is my paper? Well, finally someone retrieved it and realized what had happened. So, and in fact, even the president was wondering what had happened to me. I happened to get a grant in that year to spend a month in the Swedish Parliament, and that's when Clinton called me to say that I was going to be nominated, and I was in Sweden. I don't know, sweet justice, I guess.
What was Clinton like?
Well,
What is Clinton like? I mean,
I think that he could explain, particularly to Democrats, but to the general public, explain to them what was going on now, what's happening to us. He had that gift, and I think he is still able to do that. The ability to explain to ordinary people that this is where we are, this is where we're going, we don't want to go there, we want to go here, and this is how we would go here rather than there.
So it's communication skills.
It's communication. I mean, I think just yesterday he said, we need more immigrants in this country. We can't afford to pay for the retirees. We don't have enough people to produce jobs. We've got to grow the population. Given our birth rate, there's only one way to grow it, more immigrants. And of course, he's talking about immigrants that not only have skills, but from all over. But this sort of idea, I went to the '88 convention as leading the Clinton, the Dukakis delegation, and I had lobbied for Clinton, the unknown Governor Clinton, literally unknown, to give one of the two speeches, either the policy speech or the keynote address. I really had lobbied hard, and Dukakis and I were very good friends. Well, Ann Richards, the governor of Texas, got the keynote address, and this is where she has your famous line that George Bush, the first George Bush, was born with a
silver foot in his mouth.
Silver foot in his mouth, right. No, born on third base, and he thought he had hit a triple. Yeah. And I was expecting Clinton to give this magnificent speech that he had given before, and all of the Democrats would hear it, and a star would be born. Well, this speech was a disaster.
The long
he actually got booed, and I had set it up so the first thing that happened after this speech is that he would come to the Wisconsin hotel and meet with the Wisconsin press the next morning, and we'd be on our way to, well, he came to the hotel, and the Wisconsin press just loved this, of course, because they got first crack at him. But he recovered, as you recall. And
actually, he was one of the first candidates then to go on the late night talk shows.
He went on the Johnny Carson show.
And joked about it.
And joked about it and played the saxophone. And I remember this saved him. Johnny Carson made Bill Clinton president just as much as anybody else did.
And now they all have to make a stop at all of the talk shows.
They do.
Is that a good thing?
Oh, sure. I think that you don't want presidential candidates to be comedians. But the viewership they have there is important. And it shows a personal, I mean, leadership is about character. And when you talk about running for governor, people vote for governor based on what they see of the character, less on the issues, but issues are important.
Whether they like the person.
Whether they like the person. And Tommy he wasn't as likable then as he became, because as he became more himself, I think that's shown through. So character is very much something that voters judge, and they have to see you in situations where you're not giving a speech. Goodness knows who knows when this will be seen by anybody, but we're right now in the middle of parliamentary elections in the United Kingdom. And the current Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, inadvertently was recorded as saying that woman doesn't know what she's talking about, one of the voters. Well, people felt, well, this is what he's really like in private. It's not that person we see in public.
I
These
noticed
things
that
count.
the next day he went to see her in
Went to
person
see her
when this hit and apologized profusely.
Begged for forgiveness. But Norway was during an exciting time. This was I always sort of to come into things at the end of an era. This was the end of the Cold War. Norway has a border with. It was the only NATO member. It was a NATO member with a border with the Soviet Union, and in the north, in Murmansk, is where all the Soviet submarine fleet was. The ones that were going to attack us, that's where they all are, in the Norwegian border. Well, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Russia now was on the border. And my task became to really help this transition period when Norway NATO member would become Norway NATO member, but neighbor to Russia. So my big accomplishment during this period was to negotiate a treaty where the Russians would not dump low-level radioactive waste into the Arctic Ocean. The low-level liquid waste is essentially what cools the reactor in a submarine. It's like the radiator waste. It was also the time when Norway voted for a second time whether to join the European Union. So dominating politics for 18 months while I was there was this question. The vote itself only was one day, but you have to negotiate how you're going to join as the run-up of the vote. You have to give up some sovereign rights. You have to share resources. Norway would be a net payer into the Union.
Because of the oil money.
Natural resources. They would have to open their fishing banks to the Spaniards. All of these things had to be negotiated. Germany and Helmut Kohl so much wanted Norway in the European Union, the last possible country to join that would put money in rather than take money out. But they voted no.
Norwegians did.
51 to 49, the same vote as 20 years earlier.
Wow.
The other big thing going on was that Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic wanted to join NATO. The United States wanted them in NATO. Other NATO countries didn't necessarily think this was a good idea. They still felt that Russia is out there. It may be no longer called the Soviet Union, but it's still there and we got to deal with this. So I spent a lot of trying to convince the Norwegians that they had to be part of this, including taking a delegation of members of parliament to Warsaw, myself, to introduce them to the Polish leaders. It was also a time when Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the three Baltic countries, had just gained a fragile independence. Soviet troops, Russian troops had just left. And this, you may recall that it was Gorbachev. There was shooting. Soviet troops didn't know what to do. Are we supposed to shoot these people or are we supposed to go home? And the idea that we needed to act very quickly to bring those three nations into the Western sphere. And this was something also the Norwegians were not interested in.
So all in all, would you say your tenure as ambassador to Norway was successful?
Yeah, I think so. Being an ambassador is very hard work. It's pretty much just you representing the president. In other words, you don't represent the State Department. You're not representing the Secretary of State. In our system, you're representing the president. And I remember my first visit to the Prime Minister. You see the King, present your credentials, a wonderful man who I had the pleasure of traveling with for 3 weeks on Their Majesty's first ever state visit to the United States, and going into the Clinton White House for a state dinner, which was as organized as the Clinton White House reputation was. I'll digress. My biggest diplomatic victory there was negotiating when the King could have a cigarette and where. But I think that everything I had done up to that point was good training to become an ambassador. And when I went in to see the Prime Minister to talk for the first time, I was talking about environmental issues and at the end of the Cold War and how we were partners and we were going to go on. And she said, "Boy, this is refreshing. I've had 12 years of being lectured at by the Reagan and Bush people, and this is wonderful." That started a relationship with her, her successors and their staff and all of the cabinet and the politicians, which was, they're all my friends to this day. I see them quite often. I'm involved in projects with many of them.
Now, did you communicate directly with the President or his people then as ambassador, or through the State Department, or what?
Generally, you're with the State Department, but you have the right, and the country that you're in expects that you have the ability to simply call the President.
And did you?
I did once. And it was when Nelson Mandela came to Norway to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. And I was in my office. It was 12 noon. The Peace Prize is given at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I was just waiting to go over to the ceremonies. I got a call, and my secretary, Sue Meyer, who had been my secretary when I was Speaker, called in and said, "Nelson Mandela's on the phone." I didn't doubt this. But my first reaction is, now what has the United States done wrong? This is bad, isn't it? Is he going to call me an hour before he's giving his Nobel lecture to give greetings? I don't think so. He asked me would I come to his hotel suite after the Nobel lecture and after the ceremonies, but before the dinner. Well, of course I'm going there. So he's in the Grand Hotel in Oslo and in his suite waiting for the evening's events. And I come in, and he made me feel like I had won the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, he was the most gracious man. You could sense you were in the presence of just something different and calming and special. Could a human being get to be this good and exude it from their personality? He said, "You've got to help me." It was the final round of negotiations over forming the World Trade Organization. And the issue was textiles and quotas and tariffs. South Africa is a big textile producer. He said, "I can't be president." He wasn't president. The election hadn't been held. He was only going to become president 8 months hence. "If you take textile jobs away from us, you've got to change this." I said, in all my boldness, "Okay, but what are you going to say?" So I called Mickey Cantor.
In the White House, President's economic?
He was the trade representative. He was in South Africa doing the negotiations also were in South Africa. And I said, "Mickey, here's the deal. I'll come back to Nelson Mandela's room tomorrow, and I'm going to call you and get you on the phone, and he's going to ask you this." Now, he was speaking from notes because, you know, these were relatively arcane things. And I said, "By the way, Mickey, well, here I am with Nelson Mandela. It's just the two of us. He just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he wants us to change our policy on textiles in these trade rounds. And I said we would. So tomorrow, I'll put him, tomorrow we'll call again and put him on the phone. In the meantime, I called the president and I said, Mickey's going to do something and you owe him big time, but you've got to do this. We can't not do this as a country. So it happened. And the only rule we had was, please don't, to Nelson Mandela, don't release this to the press. Let us get past this negotiating round. Each Nobel Peace Prize ceremony brought some element to it where I was intimately involved. I came to know Yasser Arafat and Shimon Peres from Israel very well. I was with them each about 5 to 6 times. I came there when the Oslo Peace Accords had just been signed, and the idea was that the negotiations to implement them would happen. That's when I arrived in Norway, at this optimistic moment. Every time something went wrong, they would convene back in Norway. And I was sent as the U.S. person to be there at that meeting. And so I had a snapshot each time. I had a specific message, and Perez in particular was wonderful to deal with. But what I witnessed over this period of time was the demise, the downfall of the Oslo Accords. Each time it was put back together, all the king's horses did it one more time, but I didn't know that's what I was witnessing. I'm now involved in a foundation that seeks to help with the peace process there. So these are exciting times to be an ambassador, and those are the times you are the president's representative.
Now you said at the end of your tenure that ambassadors shouldn't stay on too long.
Yeah, you get worn out. I mean, you should go somewhere else, to some other country. I was then hired by the former Norwegian Prime Minister to be her diplomatic advisor when she was chosen to head the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations. And I joked, well, the State Department thought I was working for the Norwegians anyway, so I'd just make it official. So I went with her to the World Health Organization.
I hate to gloss over that, but a little bit about what you did with the World Health Organization. This was at the time you were trying to eradicate polio, and the anthrax attacks happened and all sorts of stuff.
Well, the World Health Organization is part of the United Nations but elects its own leader, and there is no Security Council type apparatus. So it's one vote, one country. So a little different operations. It was 10,000 public health doctors and me was about the structure worldwide. And I was sent to Washington to do repair our relations with the U.S. government. So there I was with Donna Shalala, who was the Secretary of Health, Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton. Now later it became Tommy Thompson I dealt with.
He became the U.S. representative to the WHO.
Yes, that's the one foreign policy.
As Health and Social Services Secretary.
Yeah, that's the one foreign policy role that cabinet secretary has. But this was a period I dealt with not only the U.S. government but all of the other multilateral agencies in Washington, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and there are several more. But this was the time of SARS, the Ebola virus, the first public health treaty on tobacco, the bird flu virus, and 9/11, and after 9/11, an intense, almost manic focus on biological weapons. And a biological weapon is nothing more than a disease that is let loose in a destructive way. So our focus became this war against the biological terrorist. And the big fear was that not malaria. Well,
Anthrax?
No, smallpox. Smallpox.
Would be re-released.
Re-released. There were two sources of smallpox in the world, one controlled by the Russians, one controlled by the Americans, ostensibly controlled by the World Health Organization, but physically in these two countries. And the great worry was that there were scientists, there were somehow the Russian supply could be got at. And this was the great fear that sort of consumed things after 9/11.
Biological warfare is still, of course, a huge issue as we speak now in 2010. Has there been progress, or how would progress be defined?
Well, it turns out that it's very difficult to unleash a biological agent that would have a sort of a massive impact. Smallpox would have been the exception. As you recall, there was this great push for smallpox vaccinations. We had a whole generation, maybe 2 generations, that were not vaccinated against smallpox. Soldiers that were sent to Iraq had smallpox vaccinations and this. But it is very difficult. There have been some cases, one in Japan, where a poisonous gas was unleashed in a subway. But I think the bigger fear, the more realistic fear, is nuclear material that can be engineered in a way to be put out like a dirty bomb.
The dirty bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah. So personally, you don't sit up worrying about biological warfare.
I did then.
Yeah.
Not now. By the way, the University of Wisconsin is one of the premier institutions that do research in this area, because a lot of it comes from, well, think of botulism and anthrax. These are animal-related things. Botulism developed here as a agent to do good rather than bad. But one of the perhaps the most deadly toxin there is
botulism.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that you were in charge of, or tried to do, was the campaign to eradicate polio. Now that wasn't completed by the deadline at that time, but I guess there's still being progress made?
There is progress being made, and there are, malaria was eradicated, and there seemed to be only one other disease in existence that could be eradicated rather than controlled.
Smallpox was eradicated.
Smallpox. And polio was the only other disease, virus. So for 30 years, the World Health Organization had a campaign to eradicate it. And it's basically done through immunization. And it got to the point where there were perhaps only a few hundred cases in the world, West Africa, Afghanistan, northern Pakistan. And you simply have to chase children down and immunize them. And this is done through oral drops. I mean, think of immunizing giving a drop to every child in India. Mm. We did this on the same day.
Every child in India on the same day?
You had to do it this way. The vaccine has to be kept at a low temperature, not freezing, but just above freezing. It has to be transported. So think of the country of India with the Himalayas at one end and deserts and jungles and
900
slums.
million people at the time, something like that?
And you tried to do this one day. It was like 600,000 volunteers in 300,000 sites, and it was delivered by helicopter and camel and everything.
But it was carried off.
It was carried off, and India became polio-free. The jury is still out whether this can actually happen.
Total eradication, you mean?
To chase down the last few wild viruses is proving a little harder, not because of the science, not because you don't know what to do, but because of political reasons, bad governments. We always said we'd take a good political leader or good government over a good medicine or vaccine any day of the week. Virtually every disease in the world, common disease, is easily treatable by medicines that exist and are off patent and are cheap. It's the will, the political will, and the government's ability to deliver.
And sometimes cultural. I mean,
It's cultural in
the
that
fears
that,
that the vaccine is some sort of insidious plot by the West. Or
in northern Nigeria, which was the trouble zone. This was there was a rumor spread by the leader that the polio virus was a Western colonial plot that made women sterile. It took a year to overcome that. Lot of internal Nigerian politics there as well.
overall, do you think WHO has been successful?
I think very successful. It is the one UN agency worldwide that has no competitor. In other words, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta have some function, but they are limited to inside the United States or doing things elsewhere in the world to prevent things from coming into the United States. So the World Health Organization, founded after the war to really rebuild the public health system of Europe and Asia, malaria, venereal diseases, dirty water, all of these things were the focus early on.
Let's talk about the university too, finally. You've been a regent since 2005. Has that been an enjoyable job?
Enjoyable, sometimes frustrating. I think that in my current capacity, I'm handicapped a bit about my past history, knowing so much about merger and the follow-up and how the university has changed and whatnot. But a couple of conclusions. One, in the 80s, it was clear the regents and the administrations did not have a plan for the future. That's how the legislature was really forced into action on it. There is a plan now, and it's to grow the university, to have each campus have its own plan, a vision of its own future, to have Milwaukee as another research institution, but not another Madison, an institution that is like its peer institutions around the country. That's a big step, ending the Milwaukee-Madison feud. That's a big step. I think that we are not counting on more state support in the future. In other words, we're not going to go back to the level of state support. And you'll see private funds and tuition.
Are we essentially privatizing the university?
We're a public university, but not state funded.
State funding is down to, I think, less than 20% at the Madison campus, what, 25 overall, which is down from, what, a third?
Well, a third or a half, or I mean, it depends on the campus.
So what's the fallout from that? Is that it's inevitable, I guess? Is it a good thing?
It's not a good thing, but there is a way forward, and the university, campus by campus, has to generate its own revenue. And we have been judiciously using differential tuitions, campus by campus, to fill in the holes. Madison has what is called the Madison Initiative to help with faculty recruitment, get students through classes sooner so you can have a 4-year target for degree completion. We just did one at La Crosse, another one at Eau Claire, and one at Platteville. Platteville has become a premier engineering school. We have a differential tuition for engineering students from Illinois and Iowa. And then, of course, we have a differential with Minnesota. I think the verdict on merger is that it's certainly an absolute success. We're way past that. The regents are probably only as good as the administration, because you're only as good as the ideas that are put in front of you. It's a passive board. In other words, it doesn't originate. So what you have coming to you, and if it's bad, it'll likely pass. If it's good, it'll pass. So choosing the chancellors and the president, especially the president of the system and the chancellor of the Madison and Milwaukee campuses, this is crucial. And these people are hard to find. We're extremely lucky at the moment with the stable of people that we have around the state. But state funding is not going to come back. Madison is literally a town like Florence was during the Renaissance. It is something unto itself in the world. And it is the engine that drives the Wisconsin economy in many respects. And to get the legislature and the state government to recognize that, I think, is the next step.
There's been a long-standing tension, to put it politely, between the government, the legislature, and the university system. In fact, a lot of distrust. Has that been alleviated?
It's much better. A lot of that has been due to mishaps among the administrators in certain areas. Tone deaf politically, some of this, on both ends of State Street. However, these seem tangential, given that the fact is that we're not going to have a budget in the future that makes us whole.
Our competition is international now.
Yes.
It's not so much Wisconsin versus Berkeley. I mean, we have to worry about China and India, and there are billions of people, and they're pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. They have their own schools now, and former Chancellor Wiley gave me a great quote, which was that the top 20% of Chinese population, whether you look at ambition, IQ, or whatever, is equal to the entire population of the United States.
Well, our competitors will be in China and India, as well as Europe and elsewhere, not necessarily in other states. Tragic things are happening to the California system. We'll see how that comes out. However, these are also opportunities for collaboration. In other words, research institutions around the world, especially huge ones like this, can be collaborators. And this is the test for, I think, the research community worldwide.
The Big Ten schools are athletic competitors, but they should be our partners. Is that?
We should. There are some baby steps, but we should be much more integrated into the Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois research group.
There is one?
Well, there is a framework. You don't have to go to Harvard or Berkeley or Austin or something. You need to have the dynamics are in the region, and there's some of that happening. I think the leadership of the university is so much more worldly now than it was in the 80s. The Chancellor of Madison now has her PhD in German literature. She has lived quite a long time in Europe. That's typical of most of our chancellors. Our chancellor at Milwaukee was born in Puerto Rico. His specialty is, he's a political scientist with the specialty of Puerto Rican politics. They have experiences that they're bringing to their campuses which are so important. I said we use judiciously differential tuition, private money. Thank God baby boomers who graduated from the university are now seeing mortality, and they're giving money to their alma mater.
I'll have to redo my will.
Yes. Well, there's someone that will help you. The other source of revenue is international students and out-of-state students. And this is a hard sell politically. But every out-of-state student funds an in-state student. That's how much more they pay. An international student does the same thing, but brings with a experience that helps the rest of the system. The great budget debacle for the university was, I think it was after Governor Thompson left. The legislature and the governor at the time filled some gaps in the university's budget by raising out-of-state tuition tremendously, and then counted that the money that would be brought by those students. Those students never showed up. $20,000 to go to Milwaukee, $18,000 to go. They never came. So the university had to eat that whole gap, and then make a public case is that we had to lower out-of-state tuition. This is a tough case to make, but we have to do that all over the system and bring in international students. So that's tuition, private gifts and grants, research money, and out-of-state students. These are the types of tools we have left after losing state support.
Think we can still maintain a world-class university?
I do, and not only maintain, but even improve and grow a leader, be more of a leader. Madison has always had an advantage that their research money is pretty much divorced from Pentagon research money. In other words, so it's not coming and going based on the vagaries of the Pentagon budget or whether we're in a war at a moment. It's pretty much scientific research, and that has proved to be more stable. #1 research recipient from the National Institutes of Health, for example.
I think we're like #2 overall in the entire country.
Right. And this is now public and private universities. And if you took out MIT, which has a great deal of Pentagon money in it, you know, we look more and more. The other thing is a tremendous cultural change that commercializing research and discoveries is the thing to do. Now other states are fighting this, that research is research and industry is industry and never the twain should meet. I think through WARF, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, and new rules, thanks to Chancellor Wiley and his predecessors, we have a burgeoning business development program, and it shows.
Finally, what advice do you have for the folks currently in office at either end of State Street? Any particular advice?
Well, I think it's important. I always tell students when I give a talk, I made it a goal when I was very young to use my passport every year. I watch debates about, let's say, about high-speed rail or light rail, or just to take an odd example. And I feel, haven't these people ever been anywhere in the world where this is the norm? It sounds like we're trying to build a space station rather than a railroad, for example. I think traveling even anywhere, but preferably outside the country, would be a better preparation than anything else that they could do. The Norwegian Minister of Education, when I was there, who had his PhD from Johns Hopkins, he gave a speech all the time. He said, if you want to students, he said, if you want to improve education in Norway, leave. Mm-hmm. And his idea is go somewhere else for however. Come back, but go somewhere so you know something about the world. So that's what it's boiled down to these days.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.